Hi, it's Matt here with this week's external monitoring from Murphy Solution. Now, the initiation of major US and Israeli combat operations against Iran in recent days is dominating the headlines and marks another significant shift in the global security environment. The Middle East has been a hotbed of tensions for decades, but in an era of intensifying great power competition and increasing geopolitical multipolarity, only time will tell whether this settles down to a simmer or boils over furiously. What is happening in Iran doesn't stay in the Middle East, though. It affects the narrative around Ukraine, the already strained credibility of international law, energy and maritime stability, and the wider geopolitical risk environment. In the past 48 hours, that ripple has already become more tangible, hitting liquefied natural gas supply signals, container shipping decisions, and government's ability to move people through constrained air corridors. Across the UK and Europe, there are some tightropes to walk. The EU has called for maximum restraint. Germany has asked for a plan for the day after, and the UK has drawn criticism from the US already. For many European governments, it's less about the extent of involvement and more about whether we're prepared for these ripple effects of what is more volatile and fragmented world. Part one, then. Let's look at some context and what's changed. And first, some balance. The Iranian regime is not an innocent actor in the international system. It has long engaged in destabilizing behavior itself. It has supported proxy militias across the region, supplied attack drones to Russia for use in Ukraine, threatened Israel and other regional neighbors directly, and pursued nuclear capabilities, including weapons-grade enriched uranium, all in defiance of international concern. The US and Israel's rationale for military action centers on degrading Iran's ballistic missile and nuclear capabilities, despite the latter having supposedly been obliterated some weeks ago, preventing further regional attacks and restoring deterrence and neutralizing what they describe as an imminent or escalating threat. And while it has been framed as a limited preventative operation, President Trump has essentially been pretty open about his preference for regime change. And we can already see Israel articulating expansionist security objectives elsewhere in the region. It's also worth noting that despite Trump suggesting he has the appetite for combat operations to last several weeks, perhaps longer, the true sustainability of US strategy may depend heavily on domestic political dynamics, including congressional support, which he did not seek, and electoral pressures given the looming midterm elections. Regardless of intent, when major powers build up and initiate large-scale military operations without UN Security Council backing, they shift geopolitical perceptions. Even if there are legal distinctions between Russia's invasion of Ukraine and operations in Iran, framed as preemptive self-defense, the narrative risk is obvious. If force appears to become more of a normal instrument of policy, not the tool of last resort after diplomacy fails, then others will definitely cite that precedent. The deeper structural risk is not escalation alone, but the erosion of the norm that force should be exceptional. And perceptions influence behavior, so an obfuscated or inconsistent rationale for action in Iran will likely be exploited by Russia in relation to Ukraine. China will absolutely be observing closely, considering implications for its approach to Taiwan, and other autocratic or uncooperative powers will draw their own lessons about what can be achieved through coercive means. In congested operational theatres, escalation is often less the result of deliberate expansion than miscalculation. Maritime or aviation incidents, as we've seen already, proxy retaliation, cyber spillover, or misidentified drone activity. The second major shift here is maritime and energy risk. The Strait of Hormuz carries roughly a fifth of the global oil supply. Even short-term disruptions drive insurance withdrawals, reroutings, shipping cost spikes, and market volatility. And it's not just oil. Qatar's liquid natural gas supplies and shipping lines are affected, which is how a regional war becomes a European cost and logistics problem. So security and economics are not separate domains. They're highly connected, with financialized markets able to amplify volatility far beyond the scale of any physical disruption. For the UK, this matters because of energy exposure, financial market sensitivity, and London's role in maritime insurance. For Europe more broadly, energy shocks can quickly translate into political shocks, especially in manufacturing and export-driven economies that are arguably still recovering from the last inflationary wave triggered by Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Speaking of which, European responses so far have been pretty broad, careful, and diplomatically constructed. So let's examine that ground in part two. Part 2 then, the narrative implications for Europe and the ongoing conflict in Ukraine. So far in Europe, we've heard repeated, deliberate language around maximum restraint, de-escalation, protection of civilians, freedom of navigation, and respect for international law. This language reflects a hard reality. Europe has limited leverage over the kinetic decisions, even as European basing, force protection, and air defence assets are being drawn into the spillover. It all reflects a balancing act, maintaining alliance solidarity, particularly for NATO, while preserving Europe's identity as a defender of multilateral norms. But it's equally important to consider what European states are not saying explicitly. They're not openly endorsing regime change. They're not framing this as an open-ended war, and they're not claiming ownership of the strategic decision itself. That suggests caution, and that European leaders are acutely aware of escalation risks, domestic political sensitivities, and reputational exposure in relation to Ukraine. So let me explain that last one. If European states appear to apply or support international law selectively, which they have been accused of in the past, the persuasive power of their Ukraine argument and collective deterrence may be weakened, particularly outside NATO and across the global south. Perception in these regions shapes future diplomatic coalitions, sanctions regimes, and voting behaviour in multilateral institutions such as the UN. But that doesn't mean that situations are identical. Russia launched a war of territorial conquest and subjugation. That's materially different. But credibility and legitimacy erode quickly without consistency and clarity. Discipline and radical transparency are critical. Governments must clearly articulate the basis, that's the legal basis of any support, what assistance is being provided and what assistance has also been refused. Moments like these also quietly test Europe's ambition for strategic autonomy against the enduring reality of dependence on US hard power. If European messaging is weak or conflicting, it provides fresh emotional whataboutism for Russia to amplify through its information operations. But what can organizations do? Let's explore that in the next part. So part 3 then. The converging disruptions and their domestic implications. The most immediate risk to Europe may not be military, but systemic. When major regional conflict erupts, multiple disruptions converge. Attention and deterrence bandwidth are divided. Focus shifts from previously pressing issues to Iran and the spillover from the Middle East. And that creates opportunities and openings for malign actors to exploit stress points elsewhere. Russian pressure in Ukraine may intensify, grey zone activity in the Indo-Pacific region may increase, or cyber operations that target European infrastructure may be more frequent. The most likely disruption for European organizations won't be missiles. It will be market volatility, price spikes, insurance instability, travel disruption, information operations, and policy and decision paralysis. Airspace constraints are now operational, not theoretical, and we've already seen alerts in Cyprus trigger aircraft diversions, and governments are scrambling to repatriate citizens as travel corridors tighten. Even consular capacity is impacted by geopolitical disruptions. These consular services, evacuations, diplomatic rotations, and crisis deployments become more complex, competitive, and resource intensive when these air corridors and shipping corridors are constrained. In a prolonged crisis, logistics shape geopolitics and vice versa. So what should organizations be doing now? Well, first, assume sustained volatility, not a short blip before things return to a normal or how they were before. Leaders should stress test critical aspects of contingency plans, review their cyber readiness, and rehearse supply chain disruption scenarios. All of these need to include clarification of decision-making chains, levels, and rationale, as well as checking and incorporating third-party risks and dependencies. Second, prepare for second-order effects. Disinformation, protest cycles, political polarization often follow events of significant economic stress. These events can be workshopped through exercises and discussions of how they relate to your organization. Third, preserve focus, retain capacity, and support social cohesion. Heightened securitization, which is the framing of issues through a military and defense lens, risks reshaping domestic debates. If political conversations become increasingly militarized, domestic polarization can deepen. If Europe becomes distracted or fragmented, then that benefits adversaries elsewhere. Continued support for Ukraine must remain steady and clearly framed on grounds that are distinguishable from any ongoing actions in Iran. Calm, helpful, and legally grounded communication reduces the space for manipulation and disinformation, which in turn supports the maintenance of domestic cohesion. And I'll leave you with a thought for the rest of the week. So unfortunately for the modern world, what's happening in Iran isn't just about Iran. It raises questions about the durability of international norms, the stability of global trade, and the resilience of societies far beyond the region. The Iranian regime has engaged in its own forms of destabilizing behavior. That reality forms part of the context. But so too does the long-term consequence of normalizing force as a primary policy tool. For Europe, the challenge is clear. Maintain the cohesion of alliances, defend legal principles consistently, and prepare for volatility. Resilience must be strengthened faster than instability can spread. The prepared survive, but preparedness comes from embracing complexity, not necessarily ignoring it. That complexity comes with the likelihood of having to defend ourselves through hard power and strengthen deterrence without weakening the norms that underpin it. So perhaps the real question for Europe now is, when we look back on these frenetic times, will we have been a continent that simply reacted to more instability, or one that proved it could defend both its security and its values at the same time? That's it for today's External Monitoring. We'll see you next time.